First of all, welcome to the conversation. And Chris Daw, you have done a huge number of things. You're on the BBC TV series Crime, Are We Tough Enough? You wrote the excellent book. Now I've listened to all of it, but Justice on Trial, Radical Solutions for a System at Breaking Point. So first of all, welcome to the conversation.
Thank you very much. I'm very impressed that you managed to listen to me for 7 hours.
It was very interesting, I'd say, actually. I'm really bad at listening or reading books. So it got me through an entire book. So I'm glad. Well,
your book's somewhere in the post, because you will actually get a real one. But by the sound of it, you will never need to read it.
Exactly. Well, it can sit there on the bookshelf. That's
pristine.
So really the first question I wanted to ask you, and it just came from actually one of the pieces I was listening to really just before we came on, but you talked about HMC Whitmore and the prison there, and sort of the secure unit and everything else. And I sort of wondered, because the biggest difference I think people tend to see between Norwegian prisons and the ones in the UK is just the atmosphere of prisons and, how they look. And of course, you talk in the book about, how they don't even allow sort of a grade of a sort of blade of grass or anything like that in the prisons. You've got birds getting trapped. So what would you say the biggest differences are between those two sort of styles of prisons?
I think the most important difference between the Norwegian model and the British model is that the Norwegian model is rightly focused on making the prison environment as close to the outside world as possible. So to have people live in ordinary housing units, make their own food, potentially have family come to stay occasionally, that kind of thing. So levels of normality and the normal experience of everyday life, so that when prisoners emerge from the Norwegian system, that emergence isn't particularly extreme. And so they're not challenged in the same way that prisoners are in Britain. And the reason for that challenge is because of the opposite end of the spectrum I've described, because we make our prisons as extraordinarily abnormal as possible. So we keep the living conditions in many cases in Victorian prisons of the kind that have been in movies for decades and decades. That's sort of completely alien environment that most people have only ever witnessed on television, in the form of drama. So that's for me, the main difference is the sort of othering of those in the criminal justice system that we do in Britain. So they're a different sort of form of life, and they don't belong as part of our world and our society. And the Norwegian model is they're just us, but they've made mistakes, and with the right inputs and the right kind of support systems, they will come back to being part of society and going on with their lives. And so that kind of positive mentality around, just not that binary analysis, which I suppose is the worst of it all, which is, you're either a good person or a bad person. If you're a bad person, you may as well be in prison forever and we do nothing with you. And I think that's the antithesis of the approach in Norway.
So, because one thing I find interesting, of course, is in Norway they used to it. I say recently, so within the last decade, they removed their sort of 21-year maximum sentence sort of thing. But I sort of remember listening to interviews with Norwegian prison guards where they'd say, I have to look after this person because they will be outside. They will be outside of the prison. They may be my neighbour. So, in the UK, we've kind of gone for a completely different approach of longer prison sentences. So again, what do you think the impact, of course, in the UK of having these huge long prison sentences is? And, what's the impact in Norway, where they have much shorter sentences, often, below the 21-year mark, even for very serious crimes?
Yeah, well, I think the main difference is that we in Britain, our sentencing process isn't really focused on the overall picture. So for most people, I suspect if you drill down to it, what do you want from your criminal justice system? What you want to do is reduce crime and reduce costs. So you want fewer people to be the victims of crime in the future, and you want the whole thing to cost as little as it needs to cost. Now, prisons achieve the exact opposite of that. because what they do at great cost is increase the overall number of crimes, because they act as breeding grounds for criminal behavior, criminal association, and alienating people from ordinary law-abiding lives, because the world that they go into in prison is so alien and different. So that whole mindset around the alienation of those who commit crimes and the need to keep them separate is what in the end drives crime, because you alienate a very significant and escalating number of people. The more people you put in prison, the more you alienate, the more crime you get. And that's just that's the case. When you look across the Atlantic at the US model, where there's almost 2.5 million people in prison, as opposed to our mere 80 to 85,000 at the moment in Britain. 2.5 million people in prison in a society which is supposed to be a free country, which is supposed to be a safe and good place to live, and they have to lock up 2.5 million. That's almost 1 in 100 at any one time. We're nowhere near that. But the point I'm trying to make is that where the Norwegian model is to imprison as few people as possible, the US model is as many people for as long as possible. We're kind of on the trajectory going towards the US rather than going towards the Norwegian model. The big difference between Norway and the US, massively higher levels of crime in the US versus Norway. So if we go the US way, my fear is we end up, I'm afraid, somewhere on that spectrum towards mass incarceration on a scale that's almost unimaginable.
So I think that the one thing, we obviously push is sort of reducing reoffending rates and stopping people from going into crime, or at least ensuring that if they do commit something low level, that they stay out of crime. So in terms of sort of things like education within prisons, ensuring that people can get into work after prisons, what would you say are sort of the main lessons that you would have for sort of improving the prison system so that people don't end up stuck in that vicious cycle of continuously, reoffending, leaving, not finding that there's sort of work for them, or that not able to sort of contribute to society in that way, and then ending up back in prison again?
Well, I think, the illustration I gave earlier of the Norwegian approach of making it, normalizing the prison environment. So trying to, I suppose you could look at it like an airlock. If you have the pressure between the prison environment and the outside world, so completely different, that emerging from one to the other is just an enormous shock to the system. That's exactly what kind of in the end hits people in when they come out of prison in England. Many of them, you can see it's quite bright and sunny here where I am today, but many of them literally come blinking into the sunlight from a life of almost grey darkness in very dingy prison environments with almost no time outdoors, and suddenly they're out in the world and they just have no, they've come from, it's like they've been in the deepest, darkest ocean and suddenly they're popped up onto a Caribbean beach. And what do? You have no kind of tools to deal with the environment you're in. So the Norwegian system is the diametric opposite, which is from the minute you go into prison, the entire focus is preparing you for a seamless transition from custody to everyday life. And that means when you leave prison, you will have a job already. You've probably already been working in that job for 6 months to a year on day release or weekends or whatever it might be. And you just gradually ease somebody into a life when you may have had 2 nights away from prison, staying in your family home. Let's see how that works out. And yeah, that's working well. So we're going to call it 3 nights, 4 nights. And before too long, you just taper off the custodial controls and you ease into a pattern of life, which is pretty much the same as it was the day before. Our system, you could be in a category B prison, in a secure prison environment, or even a category A prison in some cases, and you get released to the most extraordinary levels of day-to-day, minute-by-minute control into a situation where you're expected to go out and fend completely for yourself with no transitional plan, with no continuity, no nothing. And, it really doesn't take a genius to work out that, making things as different as you can in prison is going to make it more difficult for people to come out and act in a lawful and normal way. And then you end up, I'm afraid, if that doesn't happen, with the precise vicious cycle that you described.
So one of the biggest challenges of getting to this kind of justice system is, of course, convincing the public. I think crime, Are We Tough Enough was a very interesting example of, it will be easy to show people examples of where it works, how it works, and all of the rest of it. But yet, the public now, we're still going down that route of saying, oh, should we bring that back the death penalty? Not should we go towards the Nordic sort of model of rehabilitation? So given that, we are on that trajectory, it feels like towards a sort of US style justice system, which is aimed on sort of locking up as many people as possible without really getting results out of it. It doesn't really sort of reduce or stop crime from happening. How do we sort of start to shift the public towards the view that maybe trying something different, even if it feels maybe against their best instincts, that, punishment will lead to lower crime rates? How do we sort of make that shift in public opinion?
Well, I think the only thing that shifts public opinion is a shift of perception. So at the moment, the perception that people have of the criminal justice system in Britain is largely that it's soft and that sentencing is very lenient and that people are getting out away with murder on a day-to-day basis or being released by soft judges, etc. Now, that kind of belief is extraordinarily prevalent in the sort of general public consciousness. And because it's prevalent in the general public consciousness, there's a certain category of media outlet, populist radio and television kind of programs, where it's essentially just recycling that same basic sentiment back again, gets more viewers, but then spreads that kind of toxic message more widely, and so it kind of perpetrates. So I think the only answer to that real phenomenon, which is almost unavoidable in some senses, is to just try to tell people the truth, as I do. If I go onto GB News or any of the other kind of outlets which are predominantly completely misguided and ignorant in the way that they cover justice issues, I just simply say you're wrong. When I became a barrister in the mid 1990s, almost 30 years ago, we had about 40,000 people in prison. Now we have almost 90,000 in prison. And when I started out in practice, the average length of time you spent in prison for a serious crime, such as rape or murder or a serious assault, was half what it is now. So for murder, on average, you would serve 12 years in the mid-90s. Now it's almost 25 years. So it's almost double the amount of time that you spend in prison for the same thing. So the argument that the reason for we have all these terrible problems is because the system is soft, it just doesn't add up, because the system is tougher in the terms of sentencing, at least, and the number of people locked up and for the longest period of time than it's ever been. So, all I say to people is, okay, if you really do want people to go to prison for a very, very long time for things, that's your prerogative. But don't pretend that's because somehow everyone's getting less and less time in prison and something needs to be put right, because the truth is the things you're arguing for, governments have accepted for the last 20 years, and that's why we have double the prison population and double the length of sentence. So you just have to keep just hammering home the truth is my basic kind of theory, I suppose.
So another thing that sort of fascinated me actually in the book is the distinction between sort of good and evil, and and I think, again, looking primarily at the Nordic system, there doesn't seem to be as much. I mean, there is still a bit, but it doesn't seem to be as much of this very clear-cut sort of distinction between the sort of two sides. So again, how do we get away from that and making those quite easy distinctions between, that person has done something wrong and therefore obviously they are a completely bad person that can never be changed, or looking at someone else and saying, well, obviously they've never done anything wrong, they never could and aren't capable of it. So yeah, how do we sort of get away from that?
I think the answer is the same, which is you just have to kind of communicate reality, and my reality of, as I say, almost 30 years of criminal law and, dealing with people who have been accused of and have committed every crime you could possibly imagine, from murder to serious fraud to armed robbery to drug trafficking. You know, all of those people, I suppose, who most would put on the bad side, the evil side of the line, and many who have been accused of those things, who it turned out were completely innocent, and some would put on the other side of the line. But I think for me, the real kind of thinking point is, well, what about the people in the middle? What about the people that they may not have done quite as bad a thing as is suggested, but they did do something, but in their favor, they also did this good thing. And I suppose once you kind of understand that that everybody is capable of both good and bad and mixed good and bad behavior for mixed good and bad motives, once you kind of understand that it's an incredibly complex mix, then I think, you know, you're in a good place to say it doesn't help us very much to treat it as if it's a binary mix, and it's us and these bad people, and these bad people need to go away forever, even if they're only 10. As you know, we still have 10-year-old children being prosecuted for crimes in England. You know, even if they're 10, they're bad. They did a terrible thing and a terrible crime. I just think there is there's a rethinking to be done.
So another area of your books that you focused on was drugs, and you gave a fantastic sort of explanation about the history, and, you know, how we effectively, I'd say, lost our connection with what drugs were, what they were meant for. So, you know, would you be able to sort of explain a bit about, you know, how we lost that connection with drugs, but also where you think we should go in terms of legislation from here on in terms of dealing with drugs?
Yeah, sure. I mean, this is actually probably a subject that I'm the most passionate about, for the simple reason that I think it's the most idiotic policy that we have had in the last sort of century in terms of criminal justice policy, and it's so easy to reverse and therefore to make massive and beneficial changes. But you know, to summarise what I talk about in the book, and there's a chapter in the book called "Why We Should Legalise All Drugs," and you know, the reason that I kind of took that extreme approach was I went back and looked in some detail at the history of the use of psychotropic and other mood-altering substances by human beings since time began, since before we were kind of even modern humans. And the research is very interesting because what it shows is that there is significant evidence that psychotropic plants and psychotropic substances that occur in nature actually co-evolved with human beings so that they were interdependent. And that's a fascinating kind of analysis when you think about it, because what that means is, and those of your kind of viewers stroke listeners who know anything about sort of Darwinism and human evolution will understand that the way that evolution works is usually by chance, because one individual happens to have one characteristic that's particularly advantageous at a particular moment, and then suddenly the whole gene pool shifts in favor of that individual because of that one advantage or that one fluke kind of characteristic that they may have. Well, what science says is, in fact, that drugs, psychotropic drugs in particular, have achieved much more quickly and more effectively the same impact of some of those sort of shock to the system kind of moments, which have taken many generations to turn into some sort of meaningful change. So what's happened is that at some point in evolution, or very many points in evolution, we have some individual or group of individuals have taken a particular psychotropic substance. It's had a particular impact on their brain, which has meant that they have imagined or decided that there is a particularly clever way to do something which they wouldn't have thought of had they not had the psychotropic drug in the first place. And so suddenly, you know, you could, for example, have, why don't we make a round thing that we put on a stick and it's called a wheel? And that could, I mean, in the way that, you know, great artists and great musicians over the last few centuries have found the most extraordinary inspiration from periods of intoxication, so our ancestors, it may appear, had also achieved great scientific advances and great technological advances, which ultimately have led to us being where we are. So if you want to reverse all of that, what I'm saying is, without drugs, it may be we'd still be walking on four legs.
I think it's an interesting answer, and honestly, yeah, it's kind of scary to think. So, do you think that in some ways we've been held back then by this sort of process of criminalizing and sort of the sort of quote war on drugs that's sort of been going on and everything? Would you say that, and in terms as well of sort of the human cost of it, you know, in terms of drug trafficking and that kind of thing, is it sort of, how much do you think that sort of held us back?
It's not just held us back, it's killed hundreds of thousands of people in Britain alone. I mean, what people may not appreciate is that, and I'll give you probably the statistic that struck me the most as I was researching and writing the book, was a statistic about long-term problem heroin users in Britain. And in the late 1960s, we had about 1,000 long-term problem heroin users. And they weren't really that problematic because they got their heroin from their doctor, who was allowed to prescribe heroin to someone who was addicted to heroin. So they would get pharmaceutical grade heroin from the doctor at relatively modest cost, and they could go about their day and live their lives in a very kind of ordinary way. About 1,000. No crime related to heroin, no serious illness related to heroin, and almost no overdoses related to heroin at all. So that's a late 1960s, 1969, 1970, that's the position in the UK. What then happens is that Richard Nixon, the President of the United States, decides to declare a war on drugs. Richard Nixon, we all know, of course, having turned out to have been a complete crook who had to resign from office, but Richard Nixon by this stage was looking at a second term as President of the United States, and he decided that the way to get that second term was to go big on drugs. So he declared a war on drugs. He insisted that all of the US allies, and indeed almost everybody in the world, had to sign up to a convention to criminalize drugs like heroin and cocaine and cannabis, for that matter. And as a result of that, the United States passed the most serious and draconian drugs legislation in the early 1970s, and in almost around the same time, or a few months later, we passed the Misuse of Drugs Act in the United Kingdom 50 years ago. And that effectively meant that all that small group of 1,000 people who had been getting their heroin from their doctor and all the rest of it, all of that stopped. Heroin was a prohibited drug under the convention and under the Misuse of Drugs Act. You go anywhere near it, you can be prosecuted, you go to jail. So what happened next is that group of 1,000 wanted their heroin. They were heroin addicts. They'd been heroin addicts for years. They wanted their heroin. What did they do? They looked for drug suppliers, organized crime suppliers, low-level dealers who could get some heroin. There's a huge demand just from that 1,000 people, because 1,000 heroin users use a lot of heroin in a week, because heroin's is a high dependency substance. So what they do is reach out, drug dealers. Suddenly there's this new market. We've been selling cannabis mostly and cocaine a bit, but now suddenly heroin is the thing we need to get into. And so they get into heroin, and within 10 years of the Misuse of Drugs Act coming into force, by the early 1980s, we'd gone from 1,000 heroin users receiving safe pharmaceutical heroin from their doctor to 300,000 heroin addicts all buying their drugs from street dealers in just 10 years because of one piece of legislation. And when you think about the scale of the criminality that lies behind 300,000 heroin addicts, the layers of drug supply, the amount of crime that has to be committed by those 300,000 people to raise £200 a day for their heroin habit on the black market, it's just, you can't imagine a more stupid thing to do. And sadly, the impact is not just stupidity, it's not just money here and there, it's human life in massive numbers of heroin overdoses because of no access to safe pharmaceutical heroin, because of criminality around and being beaten or killed because of being involved in drug dealing, because of a heroin habit. The state, through its observance and its adherence to Richard Nixon's wishes in the early 1970s, has, I'm afraid, become a mass murderer, and there's no end in sight.
So in terms of where we go from there with drugs, sort of policy-wise, I mean, you almost hinted at it in the answer before your last one of sort of getting rid of Misuse of Drugs Act and that. So where would you like to go policy-wise? Would it be, full legalization of all drugs? Would it be something more similar to Portugal's model, sort of decriminalization? Whereabouts on that sort of scale would you go? Would you? There's also the option, of course, of going down the scale and decriminalizing and then legalizing. So whereabouts would you say you sort of fit on that?
You see, Torrin, I know that's a rhetorical question because you read the book, so you will know that the answer is that I'm very much on the side of complete licensing, regulation, and legalization. All three of those things are essential. So, take an example. You have no licensed or legal supply of drugs in Portugal. Drugs are, however, decriminalized. The problem with that model is that all of the supply chain remains in the hands of organized criminals, and they are violent and they are dangerous, and they push the price of drugs as high as possible. So that's a model which has some marginal benefits to end users who are not going to be prosecuted for being in possession of small quantities of drugs. But in terms of changing the overall dynamic, it doesn't achieve that at all. So that's one kind of model that's better than what we have, but doesn't really work. In the US, when they've done legalization in various states in terms of cannabis, California and Nevada, for example, very large states with large markets for the drug, what they've done there is that they have effectively licensed and to an extent regulated, but what they have pretty much done is allowed they've allowed the entire supply chain to become a commercial private business, and that, in its own right, drives up prices, it drives competition over trying to supply as much as possible, because private businesses are running the show and are supplying all the cannabis. So there is no model at the moment that has a fully licensed, legalized and regulated supply chain. And what I would have is dispensaries. They could be contracted out to the private sector, or they could be run directly by the state. Probably the former would make more sense given the state's catastrophic record of running most things. But a nationwide series of dispensaries where you could obtain cocaine, ecstasy, cannabis, heroin, any of the other drugs that are currently prohibited, in packaging which was brand neutral, had no branding, just told you what you were getting, MDMA, this much, how many milligrams, all of that stuff. And, provided you were over the age of 18, you could go there and within reason, not necessarily in large quantities, but you could get pretty much anything you wanted. That would be the model for me that would get rid of all of the current problems caused by prohibition, which are organized crime activity around the supply of drugs, unsafe drugs because there's no one checking what's in each tablet or what's in each vial of heroin, so you have these sort of overdose and other risks, and just the sheer amount of collateral crime that has to be committed to pay for drugs at street prices. People may or may not know that cocaine in Colombia can be bought pure for about $1,000 a kilo. By the time that's been cut and entered on the streets of Britain, it's $100,000. It's 100 times more along the way, with all the dealers and everybody else that's cut in. The government can buy the $1,000 pure. In fact, the government, because of the quantity they'd be buying, could probably buy $500 pure. Yeah. That could be supplied in the dispensaries at a dosage cost of almost zero. So as opposed to users being on the streets paying £100 and £200 a day for heroin or cocaine, if they're a severe cocaine addict, they don't need to do any of that. So they don't need to go and steal £1,000 a week. They don't need to go and, rob kids of their mobile phones and all the other kind of crazy stuff, break into houses and steal, a Sky TV box or something. I mean, these are the sorts of crimes that are committed by people who are trying to find £1,000 to £1,200 or £1,400 a week. None of that in my system.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the conversation, and it's been brilliant to have you on, and some great answers. And I have to say, overall, I cannot recommend Radical Solutions for a System at Breaking Point, Justice on Trial. It's a brilliant book. So thank you for coming on.
You say you cannot recommend it?
I can't recommend it enough. Don't worry.
Thanks, Torrin. Good to talk, and thanks for having me on to talk about this stuff.
That's okay. Thanks.